Hello everyone, and welcome to the exercise on Matplotlib. In this exercise, we'll look at what we have seen and discussed in the Matplotlib lectures. So the exercise is putting it all together. Here is the question. It says draw 4 subplots for sine of x, cosine of x, negative sine of x, negative cosine of x. Add titles to each of the subplots and use different line styles for each subplot. Also add text labels to one or more of the subplots. Okay, so we'll start by defining our x and y values and then draw the subplots and include the attributes or values in these questions. Okay, let's start by defining our x values. So we'll use the same numpy line space method. So don't forget to import numpy, pandas, matplotlib on your magic function if you haven't done so. So np dot line space, and then we'll pass our points. Let's use from -6 to 6, and let's look at 180 points. So that will be our x. For our y, we'll do the same thing we've seen in the previous lectures. We'll use numpy's cosine and sine function. So np dot cos of x. And then for sine, we'll use np dot sine of x. Okay. So now that we have those for our x and y values, we can simply call the plot and subplot methods to answer the questions. Okay, so we'll start by calling the subplot method. So we'll be having 4 subplots, right? So the best way to display it will be to have 2 rows and 2 columns. Okay, so for our subplot, we'll pass 2 to 1. So number of rows will be 2, number of columns will be 2, and this is our fig number. So that will be the best way to display it, 2 by 2. Okay, now that we have that, we'll call the plot method and then pass our x and y values. Let's pass x and the cosine function. You can pass any of them. You can start with any of the functions, it doesn't matter. So x and then cosine for our y value. For color, let's pass red, and we have the line width attribute. Let's set it to be 2.6. And for line style, we can use any of the 4 line styles we saw in the previous lecture. Let's use colon for the first subplot, and let's add a title to our subplot. So we'll call the title method plt.title, and the title will be cosine of x, or any title that you want. And to make it nice, I will also pass the grid method and set it to true. Okay, one other thing we can add is text. So we'll call the text method and then pass the x and y values. Let's pass -5 and maybe -0.3, and then the value for our text. So this will run across the subplot or any text that you want. And let's pass the rotation attribute, and let's use a rotation of 10 degrees maybe. And font size, let's set it to 15. So this will be for the first subplot. Okay, now let's move on to the second subplot, and let's plot the sine function. So we'll start by calling the subplot method and then pass the number of rows, columns, and fig number. So it will be 2 to 2, number of rows, number of columns, and our fig number, which is 2. And then we'll call the plot method, pass our x and y. Y in this case will be the sine function or sine of x. And then for color, let's use green. And we have our line width attribute. Let's set it to 3.0. And for line style, let's use a dash and a dot. Then we have our title, plt.title will be sine of x, sine x. We can also call the grid attribute and set it to true, the grid method and set it to true. So let me copy this text method and paste it here, plt.text. We can leave the positions the same. This will run across the subplot. Let's change the rotation to -10. We can adjust this later on. Okay, so the second subplot is done. Now let's move on to our third subplot, which will be 2 to 3. Number of rows, number of columns, and our fig number will be 3. So plt, and then we'll call the plot method, plt.plot, our x, and for y, we'll simply use negative of our cosine. Okay, negative value for our cosine function. So here np.cosine of x. So for our third subplot, we'll consider the negative values. Okay, negative of cos of x. And then let's set the color to blue, and let's set the line width to 3.5, and for line style we'll use the third line style, 2 dashes. Okay, and then let's give it a title, plt.title. We'll simply say negative cos of x, negative cos of x. Let's set the grid also and set it to true. So I'll leave the text section. You can add that to your plot, to your subplot. Okay, and I'll move to the last subplot, which is the negative sine of x. So 2 to 4, number of rows, number of columns, and our fig number. After that, we'll call the plot method, pass our x and y, which will be negative sine of x or negative sine. And for color, let's use a purple color. For line width, let's set it to 4.0. And our line style will be the fourth line style, which is a dash. Let's give it a title, plt.title, and pass negative sine of x. And finally, let's set a grid to it. Okay, now we have our 4 subplots. Let's run the cell and see what it looks like. Okay, looks good. We have our first subplot, our second subplot, the third subplot, and our last subplot. Okay, one thing I can add is call the figure method and pass a fig size. So plt.figure and pass the fig size attribute. I think 10 by 6 in my notebook will look nicer. You can pass a value that fits your notebook well. Let's run it again. This is much nicer, right? 10 by 6. I can even make it a bit bigger. Let's try 12 by 8. Run it again. I think this is nice, a little bit big. Yeah, I'll just leave it to maybe 10 by 7. Okay, this looks good. So here we have our 4 subplots. The first one is cosine of x, second one is sine of x, then negative cos of x, negative sine of x. We have our text labels here. This will run across the subplot, this will run across the subplot. So you can do the same for the third and fourth subplots. Negative cosine of x, negative sine of x. You see here for comparison, if you take cosine of x and sine of x, it's just cosine of x flipped. When you flip it, it becomes negative cosine of x. Okay? And things that you can do or add is, for instance, you can add x and y limits. You can add those x ticks and y ticks to each of your subplots or to all of them. Another thing you can do is add an annotation to your subplots to show, for instance, a minimum value or a maximum value. You can add any one of those or more of the attributes. Okay? You see how nice it looks? This is why we chose 2 by 2. So if you see here in each of the subplots, we used 2 for number of rows and 2 for number of columns. So we have 2 rows, right? This is the first row and the second row. And for number of columns, we used 1, 2. So it's displayed nicely. Otherwise, if you use, let's say, 1 row and 2 columns, or 1 row and 4 columns, or 1 column and 4 rows, it will be displayed differently. Okay, for instance, if you choose 1 row and 4 columns, it wouldn't look very nice because all of these 4 subplots will be displayed in 1 row. Whereas if you choose 4 rows and 1 column, you'll have each subplot in each row. So this is just an exercise to practice what we have learned so far in the Matplotlib section. Great. Thank you everyone, and see you at the next lecture.